So, Mark, thanks for doing this. Um, my first question for you is, how were you inspired by Star Trek?
I was inspired by Star Trek when I was about 10, um, which is when I first saw it during the summer repeats of the first season. I lived up in Oregon, and we didn't get NBC. It would kind of fizzle in the summer, kind of as through a snowstorm, and we could pick up the NBC affiliate out of Portland. So I'd been watching Lost in Space and Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and Outer Limits and things like that, and loved it, as all 10-year-olds would. But all the kids at school were talking about this new show called Star Trek, and the teachers were talking about it, and the teachers would even say on Thursday nights, okay, homework, and everybody in the school would, in the classroom, would groan, and the teacher would say, I know, it's Star Trek night. Okay, no homework. And so I guess I was first inspired by Star Trek because it got me out of homework. But I watched that first episode, which was the one with the Horta, the first one that I saw, and I had never seen anything like it before. It took science fiction to a whole nother level. That here's a monster, but the monster is not really a typical monster. Yes, it's killing people, but it's killing people because of what they're doing to it and its children. And I had never seen that, experienced it. I'd never thought about science fiction in those terms. And I noticed that with the next bunch of episodes that I watched, that there were these themes. And I didn't know the word theme back then, or didn't know what it meant, but I do now, and they were there, which would teach us these little morality lessons about ourselves, using aliens and monsters sometimes, but science fiction concepts to look at the human condition. So it was a whole awakening for me as far as what science fiction could do. It was entertaining, it was fun, it was colorful, but it would get you to think. And I believe that's the reason it's still popular to this day.
Um, so I'm gonna ask you about Irwin Allen in a minute, but
Sure.
how did you get involved in TV and film production, writing, directing, that sort of the whole shebang?
I always knew I wanted to be a writer. From right around that time that I started seeing Star Trek when I was 10, 11, 12, in that period, because I was so entertained, but more so moved by how movies and TV could communicate ideas and get us to think about ourselves and our friends and our loved ones and where we were going and what we were doing by empathizing and relating to these characters on the screen. And so I discovered I had an imagination. I could come up with stories. And I would test that, not intending to test it, but when back then in the 60s, they would always show a 1-minute coming attraction for next week's episode. And I was just so anxious to see that episode that I would start constructing it in my mind based on that 1 minute worth of clips that I'd seen. And then it would be fun and interesting to see it when it came on days later and see how close I had gotten to coming up with a story. And it would always be different, of course, but not always better than what I had envisioned in my mind. So I always knew I wanted to do that. And I just started writing when I was in junior high. And I submitted my first script to a TV show when I was in high school. And the producer actually responded and said, I'm not going to buy this, but it's pretty good considering you're 16. And after you're out of high school and you do a little college, come back, we'll probably still be on the air. And I'd like to see what you're doing at that point. So that was just a way that I kind of got into the industry. And with Star Trek, it was probably my greatest role model as a writer because it was so entertaining, and yet there was a message in every story. So that showed me what the power of writing and what television could do. And then I met Gene Roddenberry, and I pitched the Sarek episode for Next Generation, and asked him if uh, I always loved that book, The Making of Star Trek, which came out in '69, I believe, late '68, August '68, while the show was still on the air in its second season. So it was incomplete, but it kind of showed you how that show got started and used memos from the show and things of that nature. And I asked him, you know, it mainly talked about the creation of the show and the pilots, with a little bit about the first year. And I asked him, did you save memos like this for all the episodes? And he had. I mean, boxes and boxes and boxes. And so I said, you know, I would love to see a book that would examine every episode of Star Trek and show the memos, and what you guys were thinking and what you were up against. And he invited me to do it. Gave me interviews, gave me access to the memos, the scripts, everything else. And so I ended up doing those books. These are the Voyages, 3 books, one for each season of the original show. And now we've got the ones out for the 1970s as well.
Well, how did you end up meeting Gene Roddenberry to begin with? You know, most of us wouldn't even have access, let alone be able to meet him and talk to him about that.
Well, I had been working in LA as a writer, not doing primetime TV, which is what I really wanted to do, but working for a company that did industrial films and specials and educational videos and things like that. So I was apprenticing with that show. And the guy who ran the company called us all in one day and he said, we want to do a TV special, an hour-long special for one of the local stations out here on Star Trek. And how it just keeps growing and growing. And at that point, it was in the early 80s, and so you had the original series, you had the animated series, you had the reruns that just kept going forever, you had the conventions, and they had already made Star Trek the motion picture, and that had been released, and they were in the process of making Wrath of Khan. So his office contacted Gene Roddenberry at Paramount and to see if he'd be interviewed for the special. And Gene was a very gracious man. He just always had an open door to the fans, to the industry, to everybody. How he found time is beyond me. He corresponded with everybody. It's really quite remarkable. In his private papers, there's tens of thousands of letters that he received and responded to, on top of all the scripts and all the other things he was doing. And so Bill, who ran the company, asked if any of us knew a lot about Star Trek, and I said, I do. I love it. It kind of inspired me to want to be a writer more than probably any other show. And he said, well, then you go in and interview him. You know? So it's like, okay. And so I went down to Paramount, and I met Susan Sackett in the outer office, and then I met Gene Roddenberry in the inner office, and I interviewed him a couple times, and he gave me access to all the scripts and the memos, as I mentioned before. So that was that introduction. Then it was a few years later when Next Generation went on, and we had actually been corresponding, which I thought was, wow, how wonderful. And then I later found out that he corresponded with everybody. I mean, he just was incredible about that. And so I wrote him, you know, we sent cards to each other, holiday cards and things like that. I wrote him a letter and said, I'd like to come in and pitch for Next Generation. And he said, sure. And I went in and pitched Sarek. Pitched a few things before I pitched Sarek, but Sarek was the one that he wanted.
That is so cool. Let's talk about These Are the Voyages, the season by season. And I have to say, I loved Stephen Whitfield's book, so I can see why you were inspired by that.
Oh, yeah. And especially, you're so much younger than me, but especially back then. I mean, I got that book in '69, and I think I was 15 or 16, and what an eye-opener it was to the television industry, which I wanted to get into at that point, which I knew was my goal. And just seeing those memos and being walked through the whole process of making a TV series and creating and launching a TV series. I must have read it half a dozen times. It's a big book, you know, what is probably 600 pages, and I wanted it to be so much bigger. I read it, so I ended up doing one, a series of books that are so much bigger. One of the reviewers wrote of my books, These Are the Voyages, he wrote that the making of Star Trek kind of serves as a foreword for my books, because in comparison, it's this big, and my books are like that. And they would have been a lot bigger if it hadn't been for an editor saying, well, let's not put all this stuff in there, because the memos for that show are just fantastic. Hearing the conversations between Roddenberry and Dorothy Fontana and Gene Kuhn and Bob Justman and Stan Robertson at NBC on every episode, hearing them talking about why they want to do this one and what can't be done due to censorship, or what can't be done due to budget restrictions, and just what was possible back then in the pre-CGI days, is really a fascinating process for me to have gone through all that stuff and read it, and I wanted to share it with the fans. So those books could have been a lot bigger.
Well, one of the things I love about them is you talk about the various rewrites and how certain things were originally, well, Shore Leave is a good example. Talk about, you know, the rock and how they were going to pop out of the rock and then they're going to slam the rock down, and then they changed it over to being just McCoy disappearing and not having it on screen at all, which was so much better. It's fascinating to me, the process.
Theodore Sturgeon wrote that script, and Theodore Sturgeon was a sci-fi novelist with a great imagination, but he had no idea about what was possible in television and what things cost. So he wrote things into his script that would have been great in a book, but they could not have been done on TV. So yeah, you're referring to the memos for that episode where Roddenberry is trying to tell Ted Sturgeon that, well, we can't do this. And Bob Justman would be the one telling Roddenberry. I loved Bob Justman's memos more than any of them, because he had such a sarcastic wit. And Bob Justman's job, for those who don't know, he was the associate producer. He was the line producer, the guy who had to take the script and make a reality out of it. He had to take it to the stage and get it produced. So his memos, when every draft of every script would come down, he'd be writing in saying, if you don't take some of these special effects out of this episode, I'm going to start sending you the bill for my analyst. Because it was just, they were driving him crazy. So his memos are very funny, and they tell you a lot about production, but he had a great sense of story too, and made a lot of wonderful suggestions about the stories. But Roddenberry's memos are very interesting because he would always talk about theme and about keeping the protagonist front and center in the story. And in Star Trek, the protagonist is Kirk, the narrator, the one who's telling us about the voyages. And people would say, well, I want to write a Spock story, like This Side of Paradise or Amok Time. And that's great. They love to do Spock stories, but it had to be more so a Kirk story, because Kirk is the protagonist, he's the storyteller. So it was always, okay, so Spock has been shot by these spores, and he's falling in love with Jill Ireland, and he's never experienced this before, so that's a great Spock story. But what makes it a Kirk story is, how's Kirk going to deal with this? How's he going to deal with losing his first officer and his friend? How's he going to deal with his crew mutiny and going down to the planet and leaving them all alone on the ship? And that poignant moment where he does the captain's log and he says, I never realized how big this ship was, because it's without the people. It's just a bunch of empty rooms. So Roddenberry would kind of focus on that, talking to the writers about how to bring those elements out and keep the protagonist front and center. And Gene Kuhn would do that too, and Dorothy Fontana would do that too. Their memos going to Gene Roddenberry, and then he would pass them on. But Bob Justman would be the guy writing to Roddenberry saying, we cannot do this. How are we going to do this? And all that stuff. So, and then NBC would be writing their memos saying, you cannot do this on our network. So it's really interesting conflict and an interesting battle on every single episode getting these shows made. And a great example of what it is to be in television.
Let's talk about season 3 because it gets maligned a lot, but I know you've expressed fondness for it. Why does season 3 have such a bad reputation?
Well, as we learn when you read the books, season 3, the budget was cut. They were put in a bad time slot, which really a terrible time slot, the worst time slot of the week. It's called the death slot. Fridays from 10 to 11, especially for a young audience. The kids can't stay up that late, and the teenagers are all out at school events, football games, dates, movies. Who's home watching TV? Grandma. And Grandma didn't watch Star Trek, and there were no VCRs back then, no DVRs, no streaming. You either were home to see it or you missed it. So it was a great morale killer when the network moved it into the death slot. But also Paramount had taken over Desilu by that point. And Desilu had gone out of business because of Star Trek and Mission Impossible. Fascinating story, and I don't want to get off track with the question you asked, but we can come back to it if you like, about the old guard at Desilu trying to convince Lucille Ball not to take Star Trek, not to put it on the air, saying it will bankrupt the studio. Well, it did. And so Paramount buys Desilu. And they're determined that they're not going to go bankrupt over Star Trek. So they cut the budget horribly. And so Bob Justman writes this very poignant, very sad memo to Gene Roddenberry right around the beginning of the third season. And he says, we're expected to do half a science fiction movie every week with the budget of a radio show. You know, how are we going to do that? But you also had fatigue. Star Trek was the hardest show ever attempted, ever made. When you read the books and you read the memos, you see that. You see how exhausting it was. So by the time you get to your third year, people are getting tired. And so a combination of fatigue, budget cut, and being demoralized with the time period contributed to the third season not being as good as the other two. Having said that, there's a lot of good episodes in the third season, and they certainly were still trying their best. But with the budget cut like it was, there were just a lot of things they couldn't do that they were able to do in the first two seasons.
What do you think would have happened if they could have had a season 4?
Well, if they had been in a better time period, and when NBC reluctantly renewed Star Trek for a third year because of about 1 million people protesting the cancellation of the show, because it had been announced it was going to be taken off the air, and they received tons of letters and petitions. They didn't receive 1 million letters, but when you count all the signatures on the petitions plus the letters, it came up to about 1 million. And people were actually marching on NBC Burbank and NBC Rockefeller Plaza in New York, and even up in Oakland on the affiliates and so forth. And the media was all over it. They were covering it. So NBC cried uncle, and they picked it up for a third year. And they were going to move it on to Monday nights from 8 to 9. And that would have been a great time period for Star Trek and a great night. But Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In premiered as a summer replacement show in that time period on NBC right before then, and was #1 in the ratings. And it was scheduled to go on Fridays at 10 for the new season. And George Slater, the producer, threw a fit. And he said, we refuse to have that time period. So NBC switched it, and they stuck Star Trek in the late time period and Laugh-In on Monday nights. So if there had been a fourth season, it would have had to have had a better time period. But it wasn't going to happen, because NBC, when they renewed Star Trek for a third year and made the decision to put it on in the death slot, they also made the decision that this would be the last season, no matter how it performed. And it did not perform badly. The opening episode for the third season was Spock's Brain, and you see in those books, we have the AC Nielsen ratings report for every single episode. And Spock's Brain won its time slot. It beat Judd for the Defense on ABC, which had just won an Emmy as the best dramatic series on television from the previous year. And it beat the 2-hour premiere of Hawaii Five-0, which ended up going 12 seasons. So it came out of the door pretty strong. But as the school sessions picked up, school hadn't started that week, it started the next week, and the younger people were now busy with school events and dating and so forth, the ratings started coming down. Not horribly, but under a 30 audience share. And anything that got less than a 30 share back then was probably going to get canceled. So NBC actually had form letters ready before they announced they were canceling the show, so that as the letters came in, they could send these letters out as a reply. And the letters were designed to deceive the fans, because the network had made a decision at that point they were going to take Star Trek off the air after all the first run episodes aired, and take it off for about 8 weeks, and then bring it back for summer repeats after about an 8-week break. So what they were able to do in this form letter, without lying, but it was definitely meant to deceive, is they told everyone who was writing in, Star Trek will be returning to the NBC network. That's true. It was going to return for summer repeats after an 8-week break. Well, most of the fans thought that meant that it was going to be coming back for a 4th season. So they didn't go out and protest. They didn't storm NBC Rockefeller Plaza. They didn't keep writing in letters. They didn't start writing to sponsors complaining about NBC and things of that nature. And so NBC was able to get rid of Star Trek without having to fight that war. By the time people realized it wasn't coming back, by the time the fall season schedule had been released and publicized, and Star Trek wasn't on it, it was too late to do anything about it.
Oh, that's sneaky. Not very nice at all.
Corporate America.
Let's talk about Irwin Allen a minute, because you've done 3 volumes of Lost in Space, and you also did 1 volume of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea.
Second volume comes out in about 3 months.
Awesome. Okay. And you've also written about I Spy as well.
Yeah.
What appealed to you about writing about those shows?
Well, after I finished the Star Trek books, I did the I Spy book first. That was my first book. And I chose I Spy because it changed the face of television, literally. It was the first show to put a white and a black against each other as equals on TV. And Bill Cosby was the first black actor to win an Emmy for a lead role, and he won 3 years in a row. The same time that Sidney Poitier won his Oscar for a film. So this was a big opening up for black actors, for civil rights, things of that nature. And it also redesigned production because it filmed around the world, and they had to come up with the technology to make that possible. Wireless microphones, smaller Airflex cameras, the whole bit. And they'd load them into a Flying Tiger and fly around to these different countries to shoot the series. So it was a very important series for a lot of reasons. It was a very hip series, and it was a very popular series. So I wrote that book. And I interviewed Bob Cope and Bill Cosby and everybody and did that. It was well received. So I thought, well, I want to do more of these. And I had told Gene Roddenberry years earlier that I wanted to do these Star Trek books. He'd given me the interviews. I'd interviewed a lot of other people. I'd collected all these memos and scripts. But I didn't want to start with that because I wanted to test the waters with another book. The Star Trek thing was just going to be a huge project. So after the I Spy book, I did the 3-volume set for Star Trek. And when that was finished, and it was very well received, and we won a Saturn Award for literary achievement and so forth, my publisher asked me what I wanted to do next. And I had met Kevin Burns at a convention where they had sent me, my publisher had sent me to promote the Star Trek books. Kevin Burns owns Synthesis Entertainment and Prometheus Entertainment, and he's the caretaker of all the Irwin Allen properties. And he knew of my books. And so we were talking, and I said, would you like to see me do books like these in some of Irwin Allen's shows? And he said, absolutely. And that he would give me access to Irwin's private papers and archives and show files and everything else. And I'd always, so now to answer your question, you can edit all that out if you want. So to answer your question, I always wondered about Irwin Allen. Nobody had ever written about him. And I always wondered, is he crazy? Because he would direct the pilots for his TV shows. He directed the pilot for Voyage Beyond the Sea, for Lost in Space, Time Tunnel, Land of the Giants, and they were extremely good for their time. I mean, epic. But they were stuff adults could watch as well as kids. And the shows were then patterned after the pilots. And usually the first season of the shows were stuff the whole family could watch and enjoy. They weren't just for the kids. But by the second season with Lost in Space, the third season for Voyage, the shows started really aiming down to the younger audience, and adults were having more and more trouble watching them. And I wondered, why did he change his shows? Why did they always kind of go in that direction? So I wanted to know about him, and I wanted to know about his thinking process. The other reason I wanted to write the books was because Voyage to Beyond the Sea and Lost in Space came out before Star Trek. And if it wasn't for those two shows, there wouldn't have been a Star Trek. So in a way, if you're writing the definitive history of Star Trek, you can't leave that out. That opened the door for Star Trek every bit as much as I Spy opened the door for interracial casting on other shows like Room 222 and Mod Squad and on and on and on. So having access to his private papers, I was able to go do a deep dive and find out how his mind worked and why the shows changed and everything else. And so it was a very interesting process for me, very great revelation into his thinking and what changed these shows. And those are those books.
Does that mean then you plan to do a Land of the Giants and maybe even explain why he went into the disaster genre for films in the 70s?
I would be interested in it, more so his film career. I do cover his early film career in Volume 1 of Lost in Space and Volume 1 of Voyage Beyond the Sea, because you got to know about his life before you can start reading about those shows, the same way I covered Gene Roddenberry's early career in Volume 1 of These Are the Voyages. A real rags to riches story. I mean, he was a poor kid. And he came to L.A. without knowing anybody. He and his cousin Al Gell drove out here. And it was on that drive that he decided to change his name to Irwin Allen. His first name was Irwin, but his last name was, they were Russian Jewish immigrants, and it was a very difficult name to pronounce. And you don't even find any of this on the internet. It's in my books, you know, but I got all this by going through his private papers, found out what his real name was, and we interviewed Al Gell, and we interviewed his manager and everybody, and found out the process that he went through. So he, you know, because he was a poor kid, he lived in dreams. He read Treasure Island. He read 2,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He read The Time Machine. And they just fascinated him. And he loved Saturday morning serials at the movie theaters with the cliffhangers. And so when he came out here, he wanted to make that kind of product. And he wanted to entertain people the way he had been entertained as a kid. It was never important to Irwin to deliver messages. You know, he would always say, if you want a message delivered, call Western Union. He wanted to entertain kids like he was, and like he still was. He was like a big kid. So he came out and he worked his way up. You know, he started selling ads for an entertainment magazine, and then started writing a column for it, and then got himself a radio show as kind of a Rona Barrett type with Hollywood Gossip, and then became a literary agent. And then finally, using all those connections he made, became a producer and made movies. including Voyage Beyond the Sea in 1961, a feature film, and The Lost World with dinosaurs and everything. And he won an Academy Award. And so what happened was 20th Century Fox was going broke, because it was the year they made, in the early 60s, the year they made Cleopatra, which went so far over budget, the studio had no money. And so they had to cancel all the films that they had slated, except for Sound of Music, which was already underway, and it was costing a lot of money. So they didn't have any money to make more movies, because Irwin's movies did well. And so he would have kept making movies for them, but he couldn't. But their TV division was still operating. And so Irwin went to ABC and said, I had a movie a couple years ago, Voyage Beyond the Sea. We saved all the models. One of them is 27 feet long. We saved all the costumes. We saved all the sets. We have tons of stock footage. I want to come make this as an hour-long show for you. And they said, it's never been done. You can't do it. There's been the Twilight Zone. There's been the Outer Limits, but those were anthologies. They didn't have to stay on a production schedule with a regular cast. They could shoot 2 episodes simultaneously if they fell behind. They didn't have to have special effects in every episode, or alien makeup, or futuristic sets. And neither had done that well in the ratings. So they said, it's never been done, it can't be done. He said, I will do it. And I will bring all these things, I'll sell them to you for $1. And then I'll make the series on whatever your normal hour-long budget is. And I won't miss any delivery dates. So they took a chance with him, and he delivered in every way, and he delivered with an audience. Voyage Beyond the Sea came right out of the gate, winning its time period. So that was fall of 64. So in the fall of 65, CBS came to him and said, we want one. Voyage Beyond the Sea is killing us. We want a show like that. And he said, how about Swiss Family Robinson in outer space? And who's going to say no to that idea? I mean, his concepts were just giant. Always based on classic literature, but rethought and repitched for television. And they put on Lost in Space. He did it on budget. He did it on schedule. And it was winning its time period for CBS. His one stipulation was you don't put it opposite Voyage Beyond the Sea. And so, you know, he was other than Quinn Martin, who had 3 hour-long series running simultaneously, Irwin Allen was the only other producer in the 1960s who had 3 series running simultaneously: Voyage, Lost in Space, and Time Tunnel. So he really, that's what got NBC to do Star Trek. They'd already made 2 pilots, but they were hesitant about putting it on the air, because could Gene Roddenberry possibly do it on budget, do it on schedule, not miss air dates? And Desilu was apprehensive about it too. But because of the success Irwin Allen was having with his shows, NBC said, well, we got to have one of these too. And that's when they went for Star Trek.
That's so cool. And thank you for tying in Irwin Allen and his visionary.
Yeah, it just does tie in. And that's why I had to do those books, because, and it's interesting going through Irwin Allen's private papers. He kept a whole filing cabinet of papers just on Star Trek. He collected the reviews, he collected the ratings, he would compare Voyage's ratings and Lost in Space's ratings to Star Trek. He was watching Star Trek very closely, but Irwin couldn't do Star Trek because Irwin's shows were on during the family hour, 7:30 to 8:30. Star Trek was on 8:30 to 9:30, and during its last year, 10 to 11. So even though there were a lot of fights over at Star Trek with the network over censorship and what type of stories you could tell and what you could do within those stories, Irwin, it was a whole different deal with him, because Family Hour had a whole different set of rules about what you could present on TV during the time of the evening that the kids were watching. So he couldn't have done stories like Star Trek was doing.
I want to take
one more thing about Irwin. So why did his shows change? And most fans will say deteriorated, kind of weren't as good in the later seasons.
Yep.
It was the networks. The first season of Lost in Space was winning its time period. But the network was receiving a lot of letters from parents, mothers, who were upset that their kids would throw a fit if they couldn't watch Lost in Space, but then they would be having nightmares. And so CBS was putting pressure on Irwin Allen that you got to get rid of Dr. Smith and you got to get rid of the robot. Because in that first season, especially the first half of the first season, the black and white one, Dr. Smith is not played for laughs. He's a pretty dastardly character, and he's trying to kill the kids. He's programmed the robot to kill the kids because he wants to go back to Earth. And he wants the pilot, Major Don West, to fly him back to Earth. But West won't do it because of his loyalty to the Robinsons and their mission to go out and colonize this other planet. So he decides that those Robinsons have to be done away with, including the kids. And CBS would send in censor reports to him, which are all in the books, and saying, you cannot put children in peril during the family hour on the CBS television network. Yes, you're winning your time period. Thank you very much. But you've got to get rid of this Dr. Smith character. You've got to get rid of the robot. And Irwin saw that Jonathan Harris, who played Dr. Smith, was working a little bit of humor into his part. It wasn't really in the scripts, but in his delivery, he was just sneaking it in. And Irwin went into his trailer, makeup trailer, and he walked up to him and he pointed his finger at him and he said, "You, I know what you're doing. Do more." And he turned and he walked out. And they started changing the scripts a little bit for that, and they started changing the scripts a little bit for the robot. And CBS got off his back and quit insisting that these two characters be removed from the show. And something else happened. The sillier the show got, or the less serious it got, the higher the ratings went. They were good anyway, but they kept going up. And so the network decided, let's just keep going in that direction. And Irwin, unlike Gene Roddenberry, would work with the networks. If that's what you want, that's what I'll give you. Where Gene Roddenberry would fight NBC tooth and nail over everything. Say, I don't want to compromise my show. I don't want to insult my audience. I'm not going to do that. Same thing with Voices on the Sea. It started out mostly espionage stories, a little bit of monster stories tossed in. As it progressed, it became more monster, less espionage, and by the third and fourth season, it was pretty much close to being Monster of the Week. And it's because every time they featured a monster, the ratings would spike. And it would go up to a 40 share from a 32, 33 share. So the 33 is pretty good. 40 is incredible. And that means 40% of the people in America are watching the show that night, or 40% of the people who have TV sets. And so the network, ABC, kept saying, give us more of that. So that's why his shows would change, because he was responsive to the fan letter, and he was even more so responsive to the ratings and to the wants of the network.
You are reminding me of another show I love from the 60s that went downhill, which was The Man from U.N.C.L.E. It went from being a really cool show to being, campy and skunk bombs and like, oh.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that hit Lost in Space too is during the middle of its first season, Batman premiered on ABC opposite Lost in Space. And Lost in Space went from being number one in its time period to number two, still getting a darn good rating, still guaranteed renewal, 30 plus. But suddenly Batman is the latest craze, or rave, as we called it back then. And it was short-lived. I mean, the joke ran out. But for a while there, it was to be reckoned with. And so the idea on the part of CBS was, well, let's fight fire with fire. Let's make Lost in Space more camp to get that audience back, and so forth. So yeah, it's just the short-mindedness of networks and some producers, that Gene Roddenberry stuck with the integrity of Star Trek. He never cheapened it to get a quick rating. He wanted a good rating. He wanted to stay on the air, but he wanted to do a show that he could be proud of, and he wanted to do a show that scientists could watch. And that's why he sent all the Star Trek scripts over to the RAND Corporation and over to JPL, which is part of NASA. And he would let scientists read it. And his request of them was, I don't ask that everything in our scripts be probable, but I do ask that everything in our scripts be possible, given that this is 250 years from now. And the scientists would go through it. And only on one occasion that I can think of offhand, there were probably a couple others, did he go against the recommendations of the scientist. And that's when the Enterprise flies by the camera, we hear a whoosh. And there would be no whoosh in space. Sound doesn't carry in space. So the scientist said that you wouldn't hear that. And he said, yeah, but we watched the clip without the whoosh, and it's way more exciting with the whoosh. So we're going to cheat a little bit there. But other than that, they tried to stick with what the scientists told them would be possible. Maybe not probable, but possible 250 years in the future.
That is so cool. I'm going to digress a second because I'm a huge fan of the cozy mysteries that they did in the mid-'80s and early '90s. We're talking Murder, She Wrote, Matlock, and Diagnosis Murder. I know you wrote an episode of Diagnosis Murder.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, I was making the rounds as a TV writer at that point, and my agents would send out sample scripts I had written. I was working with a wonderful writer named Melody Fox. We were kind of a team at that particular moment, and they sent one of our samples to Diagnosis Murder, and they liked it, and they invited Melody and I in for a pitch. So we came in and we pitched a couple stories, and that was the one that they went with, which I don't even remember what it was about now. I think, oh yeah, it was a good story. It was, because when you pitch, a lot of times you'll do it as a what if. Like with Sarek for Star Trek, I said to Gene, I wonder what happens when a Vulcan goes through senility. And if you kind of catch them with the question, then you got their attention. And they'll say, well, what do you think would happen when a Vulcan goes through senility? And I said, well, they're telepathic, borderline. And so if a Vulcan is feeling great anxiety and inner turmoil, isn't it possible it may affect the person sitting next to him? And so Riker might become a little different and might challenge Picard on one of his orders and things like that. So that brought that about. So with Diagnosis Murder, it was, we said, what if Dick Van Dyke's character is falling in love with this woman who works at the hospital, and it turned out she was an administrator, I think. And we said, and then she is suspected of doing something that has caused the death of someone. I think she was suspected of giving out prescriptions, selling prescriptions, and then somebody OD'd on some drugs or something like that. And he's got to figure out whether she's guilty or not. And he has personal feelings for her. And more so, his son, the cop, is convinced that she's guilty. And that's going to cause conflict between Dick Van Dyke and his son. Because that's what every story is about, is conflict. So that was what we presented. We had a couple others we liked better, but they didn't want to do those for whatever reason. So that was the one they had us do. And they loved it. And they wanted us to come back and do more. They wanted us to go on staff, actually, Melody and I, but the show suddenly got canceled, surprisingly, because it was in the top 20. but it had an older demographic, and CBS wanted a younger demographic. And Melody and I were actually offered 2 staff positions at the same time. One was on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and the other was on Diagnosis Murder. Well, Buffy was number 54 in the Nielsen's. Diagnosis Murder was like number 19. So we picked Diagnosis Murder, figuring, well, this show's just going to keep going and going and going. And so the new fall schedule comes out, and Buffy at number 54 is the first show to get renewed. And Diagnosis Murder at number 19 is the first show to get canceled. And the reason why is because Buffy had a young audience, and Diagnosis Murder had an older audience. And in TV, you want to get a young audience because older people are less likely to fall for whatever a commercial is telling them. They're going to say, I'm going to buy what I've been buying my entire life. I'm not going to buy this new product, you know, where people in their teens and 20s are very open to what sponsors tell them. So even though a show is 54 and the ratings and another is 19, if the one that's 54 has almost an entirely young audience and the one that's 19 has almost an entirely older audience, sponsors want to buy slots on that other show, even though the ratings aren't as good overall. So that's why we only did one of those.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. And I realized even when I was watching it that I was the youngest person watching it.
I watched it too, not regularly, but I watched it because you asked me earlier why I became a writer. Well, it was Star Trek was a big factor, and other very imaginative shows from that time period, like The Wild Wild West, which I just thought was incredible. Part sci-fi, part Western, part espionage. But Star Trek had the themes and the statements, which really appealed to me. But another show that was on right at that time was the Dick Van Dyke Show, where he played a TV writer, and he was married to Mary Tyler Moore, and he worked with Buddy and Sally. And I thought, that's what I want to do for a living. I want to sit in an office all day with 2 funny people like Buddy and Sally and coming up with ideas and being creative, and I want to go home at night to Mary Tyler Moore. So
That was one of my favorite shows as well.
Yeah, so when I was on the set over at Diagnosis Murder, I went over to Dick Van Dyke, and he came over to me, and he said, this is a really good script. I hope you're going to do some more. I said, thank you. I said, well, you thank yourself, because you're the guy who made me want to become a writer. And the funny thing is I thought he would immediately know what I meant, because that was probably his most famous role, playing a TV writer, Rob Petrie. And he kind of said, why is that? I said, because you played a writer on TV and you were married to Mary Tyler Moore. And he started laughing, so he got it. He was a fantastic person. I remember standing there on the set, and they had to tweak the lights. And I've done a lot of directing too, so I know that when the lighting guys say 10 minutes, figure 20, but it's all lit. But after you block out the scene and you see where the actors are going to be standing and so forth, they need to adjust the lights a little bit. So they said 10 minutes, and so everybody's on set. Nobody's going to go away because it's only 10 minutes. If they were honest and they said 20, maybe you could go to your trailer for a few minutes and come back. But they say 10, so everybody's got to stay on the set. So everybody's standing around, all the other actors and the extras who played nurses who just walked in the background and things like that. Everybody's there. And Dick Van Dyke started performing for everyone to help the 10 minutes go by. And he did Chim Chimmery from Mary Poppins, which he did in the movie. Chim Chimney, Chim Chimney, Chim Chimchery. And he grabbed some prop. I don't think it was an umbrella. I don't think there was an umbrella on set, but something about the size of an umbrella. It was an umbrella he used in the movie. And he performed this song and dance thing for everybody on the set. And I mean, he was in his 70s. They don't come like him anymore. He was just a wonderful guy.
He is one of my favorite people. That's why I watch Diagnosis Murder. And I actually told my agent I wanted to write a book about Diagnosis Murder, and she goes, "No one would want to read it." I'm like, I'd love to write that book, but anyway, digressing.
My publisher would publish it.
Oh, let's talk. But let's talk about Roddenberry into the 70s.
Everything my publisher does is pop culture.
That's true. Yeah, no, and
TV shows, movies, music bands. I've done a book on the Moody Blues as well.
right.
They just published Walter Koenig's new book. Get this title: "Beaming Up and Getting Off." I think you talked to Walter, didn't you?
I did. Yes.
Yeah.
I'll think about that. Thank you.
Dick's still around, and he's such a nice person. I can't imagine that you couldn't get him to give you an interview.
Well, I know Lee Goldberg too, who used to be one of the head writers for that show.
Great.
Oh,
And you know me.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Let's talk about why you decided to take Roddenberry's story and carry it on past Star Trek and talk about his work in the 70s. What prompted that?
Well, because when I finished the third book, These Are the Voyages, the original Star Trek season 3, Sue Osborne was the editor. And I told her about what happened after that, because I'd already interviewed everybody. And so, of course, the interview goes on beyond the production of the last episode of the last season. And I'd already seen a lot of the documents. And I told her about some of the things that happened. And she said, "My God, you got to tell that story. The story's not over at all. I mean, you think Star Trek's dead with the nails hammered in the coffin, and then it goes into syndication, and it's winning its time period. And everyone thinks, okay, but there's only 79 episodes, so maybe a year, 2 years, that'll be done. Every year it's on more stations, and the ratings are higher, 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 higher. And by the mid-70s, it's on 150 stations, or 160 stations just in America, which were more stations than NBC had. I think NBC had maybe about 150, and Star Trek was on like 160. So it's being seen in more cities than it was when it was on the network. And it's beating whatever's on NBC and whatever's on the other networks. And the conventions are starting up, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the press coverage of them is fascinating. Those articles, those things that I would find on newspaper archives and I put in the books, because they're talking about it like it's Beatlemania. They've just never seen anything like it. I mean, this is the beginning of Comic-Con and everything that's come since these early Star Trek conventions. And so the industry is just stunned that this show won't die, that it's becoming more popular. Merchandising is exploding. And then you get the animated series. And then you get, and NBC had wanted the 1 hour dramatic series back in prime time. They had come to Roddenberry and Paramount in 72 and again in 73, asking for it, couldn't get it, because Nimoy was busy with Mission Impossible. Paramount was afraid if they put the show back in production, the bottom would drop out of the syndicated package. Why watch the reruns if we have new ones? That's how small their minds were. And Roddenberry was fine with putting it back on, but he wanted to do it right. And Paramount was saying, well, listen, NBC said, give us a 2 hour movie. We have to rebuild everything because they had torn everything down. So short-sighted. We have to rebuild everything, remake all the costumes, do all this stuff. This is going to cost a fortune. So we need at least a 1 year commitment. And NBC would say, well, we'll give you a 13 episode commitment and a 2 hour movie. No, it's got to be a full season. So it just kept going back and forth, and finally the idea came up to give them a half-hour cartoon series, which won an Emmy as Best Children's Program. All the original writers, the original cast, Roddenberry writing, heard over it, and DC Fontana, very adult for Saturday mornings. But they were trying to get the show back on the air. And I was out there, I was in my late teens, early 20s. I had no idea. We were all wondering, God, everybody we know is watching Star Trek. Why isn't it back in production? I had no idea all the behind-the-scenes stuff that was going on. And especially with the movies, when they finally started developing a movie in '75, and it took 4 years to get it onto the big screen. So I knew all these stories having interviewed everybody. And I told it to Sue Osborne, and she said, you got to write that book. And of course, it turned into 3 books because there's so many memos. There's just so much information. There's so much conflict behind the scenes and backstabbing going on behind the scenes, not with any of our heroes, not with any people we like, but that was just happening. So to me, it's a very rich story, and it just couldn't be told in 1 or 2 books. So it's about 1,500 pages total.
I'd like to talk about phase 2.
Yeah.
I always wonder, how would the franchise be different if phase 2 had happened and they did not do a motion picture?
I wish phase 2 had happened, and I'm one of the few who will say that. I know Mark Altman, who's a friend of mine and a Star Trek authority, feels differently because he's had me on his show, Glorious Treksters, and said so. But I always felt Star Trek belonged in a 1-hour format every week. I didn't want to wait 2 years to get the next movie. Because if it wasn't that good, you had to wait 2 years for the next one. Where if you watched it every week and one episode wasn't quite up to par, you were going to have another one 2 weeks from now. I just felt it worked as a 1-hour weekly series. And I would have loved to have seen it come back as phase 2. And I don't think you've seen that book, have you? There's a review copy available. I'll get one off to you.
Please.
But it'll be out in a couple weeks. I go through the whole, volume 1 of the 1970s books covers 1970 through 75, which is all about Star Trek becoming big again in syndication, the animated series, the conventions, all that stuff. Volume 2 starts in early 75 with them now, Paramount now deciding they're going to bring Star Trek back with the actors. And they try to do it as a movie, but they can't get a script that they like. They reject Roddenberry, horribly so. I mean, they send him a form letter. The creator of Star Trek, you're going to send him a form letter saying thanks but no thanks on your script? Are you serious? This is how they were treating him. They took pitches from everybody you can imagine that had worked for the original show and other science fiction authors, Harlan Ellison, everybody. Couldn't find a story they felt was big enough. Whereas fans were just get it going, give us something, and then give us something else and something else. So finally they decided, well, we'll do it as a TV series, and we're going to use it to launch the 4th network. Now, they had already had invitations from NBC, CBS, and ABC who wanted to get Star Trek into prime time, and they had turned them all down. And by this point, NBC was saying, okay already, we'll give you a full year commitment, plus a 2-hour premiere episode. And they turned them down because they now Paramount decided, we are going to launch our own network with Star Trek. That's how big it was. That's how hot it was. That's how strong it was. And so they put the show in development. And there's a book out there on phase 2, which I have. Unfortunately, it's got a lot of wrong information in it. And my apologies to the authors for saying that, but I'm just being truthful. They in their book, they say the show was only in development for a couple months. And the plug was pulled in August of '77, just 2-3 months after it went into development. It's not true. It was in development all the way through the end of the year. And they still had scripts coming in January and February of the following year. The plug was not pulled. The authors of that book misunderstood Bob Goodwin, who was the associate producer on it, when he said on August 3rd, a decision was made to make a feature film. No, the decision was the 2-hour premiere episode would be released in Europe as a feature film. And so They still were developing 16 episodes. And there it went. The plug finally got pulled in December, late December, even though some of the scripts were still coming in, because Paramount was having trouble selling the fourth network. They weren't having trouble selling Star Trek, just the fourth network. Hey, Deb, you can come down. I'm sorry this is going so late.
Oh, it's all right.
It's okay.
I want to get out of here by 11 and it's really hot upstairs.
Just wave as you walk by. Anyway, and if you have to leave, tell me. Throw me out.
We're getting close to being done anyway, so thank her again for me.
Okay, you can edit that out, or just leave it in and amuse everybody. I couldn't get Zoom to work, so my neighbor was wonderful and invited me over. But I think I'm overstaying my welcome. She's just getting ready to do something. So anyway, I'll back it up a little bit in case you want to edit. The plug was finally pulled in late December with more scripts coming in and over the next 2 months because Paramount was having trouble selling the fourth network. Everybody wanted Star Trek. They already had close to 200 stations ready to pick it up just for Star Trek. But they didn't want the other programs Paramount was going to throw at them. So that's why it finally got pulled. And at that point, Paramount looked at that 2-hour premiere episode that had been written, and they said, that could be a motion picture. They were already planning to do it as a motion picture in Europe and as a TV movie in America. They said, let's just do that as a motion picture. And that became Star Trek, the motion picture. So that's volume 2. Volume 3 now begins with that decision to take that script and make it as a movie, and the rewriting of the script and the production of the movie and the release of the movie and everything else. So it's a big story, way bigger than I had realized. When you see these memos and you see the fighting and you see the way Paramount was treating Gene Roddenberry, horribly. So it for somebody who's really into Star Trek and really wants to know everything that was going on, I think they'll be happy it's 3 books. For people who like just to get the Cliff Notes, no, sorry. I don't write Cliff Notes. I write in-depth examinations of the subject.
Well, I have to ask, are you going to take Roddenberry's story into the 80s and the creation of Next Generation?
I want to. I've already done all the research for another book, which would cover the other 5 movies, Wrath of Khan through The Undiscovered Country, with 100 pages for each, a little bit more. So it'd be probably another 600-page book, which is what you expect from me. I think if I ever write a book under 500 pages, people will fall out of their chairs. But I actually have written 2 that came in around 450, but usually they're over 500. So that book is planned, and I would like to do a 3-book set on Next Generation, and I've already done a lot of the research on that. But I want us to be able to get the permission of the copyright owners. I want Paramount to cooperate with the book covering the other movies. I want CBS to cooperate with the book covering Next Generation, because I want to be able to use pictures from all the episodes from the movies, not just promotional pictures, but behind the scenes pictures. I want to be able to see what their archives have as far as paperwork. I've already been through Gene Roddenberry's archives. I've already collected thousands of pages of research, but I want to give it the full treatment, as I always try to. So we will be approaching them, both Paramount and CBS, to see if they will endorse the project and get behind it. I hope they will, because I would like to do those books. But for now, you got Volume 2 and Volume 3 of the 1970s series, which will be out in a matter of weeks through my publisher, Jacobs Brown Press, and those come signed. Amazon will have Volume 2 probably in a few weeks, and we're in mid-June right now, right? Volume 3 would probably be a little later, but you can get both of them quicker direct through the publisher.
Well, I'm excited, and I look forward to seeing those as well, and also getting to see Volume 2 and 3 of the 70s, because, like I said, I haven't been able to get those yet. but love
You're
them.
going to be blown away. I mean, wait till you see how Paramount treated Gene Roddenberry. Wait till you see how terrible they were. Wait till you see how much Shatner and Nimoy contributed to the movie. They would have private powwows in an office next to the soundstage, to where if they were blocking out a scene and it wasn't quite working, Robert Weiss, Gene Roddenberry, Bill Shatner, and Leonard Nimoy would go into this back room, sometimes with Harold Livingston, sometimes with John Povil, and work it out. And I have the transcripts to all that. So you get to hear their contributions, in addition to the memos from everybody else, but from these transcripts from Shatner performing the scenes for Gene and Harold Livingston and Bob Weiss. It's really quite remarkable. And to see, I love Star Trek the Motion Picture. A lot of people say it's too slow, Wrath of Khan is better. Wrath of Khan's fun, it's a lot of fun, but I think Star Trek the Motion Picture is very loyal to the series. It's got a great theme, a great twist, a great message, and a lot of thought went into that. They also had a lot of problems with that, rewriting the script as they were filming, and then the fiasco over the special effects and everything else. The reviews were mixed, but if you go online and it'll tell you that most of the reviews were negative, forget about it. Get volume 3. I include the reviews. Not every word of every review, or else you would have needed a volume 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. But there's a very generous sampling of reviews from when that movie comes out. And they're about 50-50. Half of the people didn't like it because they were on a rush from Star Wars and they wanted a roller coaster ride and they didn't feel it was. Another half loved it. I mean, the ones who liked it, loved it. And it's really interesting to see what those critics wrote and hear why they love that movie and why they would compare it to 2001. So I think you'll really enjoy these books.
I'm looking forward to it. Let's talk about Star Trek Continues. I know you did some work with them, and I wish the fan films would have continued. I was a big fan of what they did. What was your role?
I met Vic when they were writing the script for the 3rd episode, Fairest of Them All. So they had already done the first 2. And just about everybody who worked on the show was reading my These Are the Voyages books, which came out right around then. And so they were all saying, you ought to get him in here to work with us. So Vic called me and we had lunch, and he told me the idea for Fairest of Them All and sent me the script, and I gave him notes. And that was my job from that point onward, was except for the last couple episodes, which I didn't participate on, but for about those 10 episodes in between, 8 or 9 episodes, is I was the script consultant. I would give them notes because I had gone through all of Gene Roddenberry's and Bob Justman and Dorothy Fontana and Gene Kuhn's notes, and I was able to channel Gene and Bob and Dorothy through my notes to Vic, because I knew what they would say. And I wasn't so much speaking for myself. Everything I learned from Gene Roddenberry, really. And so I was able to tell him what Gene Roddenberry might say, and Gene Kuhn and Bob Justman and Dorothy Fontana might say. And based on that, they would do a polish of the script and so forth. And then Vic asked me if I would do an episode. And he had a germ of an idea for a time travel story and asked me if I would write that. So I got Sue Osborne, who had edited my These Are the Voyages books, to work with me on the script. And we fleshed it out and wrote a teleplay based on that. And what was the name of that? Divided We Stand. So we did that one. And then I continued giving notes on some of the other episodes after that. And I brought in John D.F. Black, the original story editor from Star Trek, to give notes on, I think, my episode and maybe one other. And I brought in Judy Burns, who had written The Tholian Web, because she had told me about a sequel that she had wanted to make. And if there had been a fourth season, they wanted to do a sequel to Tholian Web. And they knew it at that time, that story wasn't done, that it could have gone another chapter. And she told me. So I called up Vic and I said, man, Judy's got a great story that they wanted to do for the original Star Trek. You've got to hear it. And that became the episode that she wrote for Star Trek Continues. I can't think of the title offhand, but it's very good. It was called The Three Kirks. That was the working title. What Judy pitched to me. I don't know what it ended up being called.
Oh, I have to go look that up because I remember seeing her name in the credits and going, "Holy cow!"
Yeah. No, I brought her in.
Oh, that's so cool. You also were a consultant on the documentary For the Love of Spock. How did that come about?
Adam called me because, I had interviewed Leonard, his father, and Leonard had the books, and Leonard called me up, very complimentary about the books, and actually gave us a great quote that we were able to use. He called them astounding. The research is astounding, and sounded so much like Spock when he said it. So when Adam started doing For the Love of Spock, and he was doing it with his dad, it was a joint project. His dad said, go call Marc Cushman. He knows more about Star Trek than anybody, which is great praise. A lot of them have said that. I mean, Walter Koenig, who wrote the foreword for one of my books, said, he said, after reading it, he said, now I know what was going on in the other rooms. So that's the thing. Everybody only knew what was going on with what they were doing. Now you can know what was going on everywhere with the memos and so forth. So Leonard told Adam, you got to call Marc Cushman and have him come in to give us consultation on anything we're talking about Star Trek, other than my direct recollections. I mean, what Leonard remembered, he remembered. But if you're going to be talking about Star Trek in a broader picture, let's get Marc in here as a consultant. So I did that. I had some meetings with Adam and some breakfasts and lunches, and we would discuss Star Trek and so forth. And I was going to be interviewed for the project too, but scheduling prevented that from happening. So I'm not in the movie. I've done a lot of other things like History Channel, the 50-year 2-hour special they did. I was in that and so forth, but I never did get in front of the camera for The Love of Spock. But Adam was super generous. He stuck my name in there 3 or 4 times in different areas. So he was very kind about it.
There's a documentary that they did for the Sci-Fi Museum, and I'm actually in that for the Star Trek book I wrote. So it's a little strange. Yeah, I did the history of all the novels that have been published.
Ah, fantastic.
Yeah, and you were talking about big, thick books. Mine was, it was like a phone book. So, yeah, I know what you mean.
A lot of them, I mean, hundreds at this point, hundreds.
Yeah.
And then throw in the comic books, hundreds, and everything else. It's just, my God. Towards the end, when I was pitching for Next Gen, I'd go in and I'd pitch to Mike Pinder and Jerry Taylor. And Mike Pinder did a weird challenge to me one time. He said, if I don't hear it in 3 words, I'm not going to buy it. It was late in the day. I think he was exhausted. They invited me in. I never asked to come in. They would invite me in. You haven't been in this season. Come in and pitch some stories. And it was like I was working for other shows, doing other things, but I knew it was a hard sell. You'd spend a week coming up with 3 or 4 ideas and get them all shot down because, we've already done that. We've already done this. And so I just didn't pursue it, but they would call me. So I went in, and he says, if I don't hear it in 3 words, Cushman, I'm not buying it. And I thought, you're the one who asked me. I just drove through 2 hours of traffic to get here, But all the 3 stories I'd worked out, I didn't know how I was going to squeeze those down to 3 words. I could squeeze them to 3 sentences, but not 3 words. So I just looked at him and I said, Picard grows old. And he looked at me and said, well, what do you mean? How? I said, he starts de-aging, starts getting younger. starts growing hair. Starts getting, well, how's that happen? And I just made up something on the spot. And they ended up doing it, but completely different. Somebody else wrote it, and it was done very differently, but than what I pitched. But they took that German idea. But I think he must have found out that I was playing a trick on him, because I was remembering an episode of the original series called The Deadly Years, where Kirk grows old. So I took Kirk grows old and made it Picard grows young. But he was pulling a trick on me. So I hit him back. And so after that, the next time I went in, they would have 3 people sitting on the couch. And they weren't producers or associate producers. They were just 3 consultants. And I would pitch a story, and one of them would clear his throat, and Jerry Taylor or Mike Pillar would look over, and the person say, comic book number 137, blah, 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 you know? And so like one guy had to memorize all the plots to all the comic books, another guy memorized all the plots, maybe it was you, all the plots to all the paperbacks. Another one had to memorize all the plots to all the various series that were being done at that point, the movies. And so if you pitch something that had been done, one of these 3 guys could speak up and let the producer know, we've already done that, or something like it. And man, it was hard to get anything by at that point, because you thought you were pitching original ideas. But when you're looking at 300, 400, 500 stories that have been done between the comics, the books, the movies, the TV episodes for 3, 4 different series at that point, trying to come up with something that hasn't been done before is very difficult.
It's true. The Judy Burns episode was called Still Treads the Shadow.
Yeah, it's a little too tricky. I'm never going to remember that
Yeah,
title.
I know exactly.
I used to always tell Vic, I always said, your titles are too hard. You know? I mean, look at the original series, The Deadly Years, This Side of Paradise, Amok Time, The Tholian Web, short, catchy, and you would hear the title, and you immediately could pull up in your mind what that episode was. And I thought Fairest of Them All was an okay title because it was a sequel to Mirror Mirror. And Divided We Stand was my title, my idea, because if you see the episode, it's about the Civil War.
Right.
And McCoy's in gray and Kirk's in blue, but they have to come together to save each other. So it's like they're divided by uniform, but together they stand. Together we stand. So Divided We Stand was the title. But a lot of those titles, Vic would come up to them, and I'd always give them hell. I'd say, who's going to remember that title? Say it again. What was that title again?
Still Treads the Shadow.
See, Judy's title was The 3 Kirks, and if you see the episode, it's the perfect title. You know?
Well, I'll
there's
just say
the real Kirk. There's the duplicate Kirk that's still on the Defiant, that's been there all these years and is now old. And there's the computer he programmed that's taken on his persona and his ego. And so there's 3 named Tiberius. So there's 3 different Kirks. That's how Judy pitched the story to me. And I always told Vic, that's the title. Just stay with it. I don't know where that title came from. If you're watching, Vic, sorry.
Well, I was going to say,
sure
for the
it's
world
great.
is hollow and I touch the sky.
Yeah, exactly. That was the one time in the original series they did this long poetic title. And man, that was a tough one to remember. Now I can remember it because we've all seen it 20 times, but right. You know, that was a tough one. But it was a line of dialogue in the episode in the episode too.
Right, true. Is Vic going to do more audiobooks of your stuff?
Probably not. That was a lot of work because it's not just Vic, it's a cast of 80. I mean, getting all those people together and recording all those audio parts, and it was a 600-page book. It took him a year working, you know, in his spare time, and he's a very busy guy, to do that. And it hasn't been selling very well. You know,
I'm sorry to hear that because I like it.
Oh, we thought it was going to go gangbusters because you got Dorothy Fontana in there reading her memos and everything else. You got, for the people who weren't alive, you know, you got Adam doing his dad, who would have done it. You got Chris Doohan, who plays Scotty in Star Trek Continues, doing his dad. and Jimmy would have done it. You know, it's just they're gone, and so it's got this remarkable cast in there of people who were actually there or their offspring. Nichelle Nichols couldn't do it. She would have, but she couldn't for health reasons. And so her sister does Nichelle's voice. I mean, it really went to a lot of work to really just make it, even Rod Roddenberry's in there, Gene Roddenberry's son, to make it everything it could be. And the sales have been lukewarm for something that took that much time and that much work to do. If it had sold well, absolutely, Vic would have done volume 2. He would have done season 2. He would have done season 3, and maybe sales will pick up at some point. But they haven't been going. I think it's because people have read the book, and it's 28 hours long, and I think the size of it, just like the size of my book, scare a lot of people away until they actually get it and start reading it and can't put it down. But I think that this is a 28-hour audiobook frightens a lot of people as well. It feels like too big of a commitment. That's all.
I love listening to it. So, in drives, just listen to it in installments. I absolutely loved it.
Well, spread the word. I mean, Vic would be happy to do another one, but he's got to make some money.
Right.
Off of this thing, and he's got a piece of the action. So he was kind of gambling his time to do it, and happily doing it. I mean, he loved having Dorothy come to his house, Dorothy Fontana and Joe D'Agosta and all these people, and doing this, he was just in awe. But it was just an immense amount of work, and so he said, well, let's see what this does. I got to get compensated for my time, and so far, the checks have been very small.
What is your favorite episode of the original series?
This Side of Paradise. And there's so many. I could say Shore Leave. I could say, the Corbomite Maneuver, The Naked Time, on and on, Doomsday Machine. God, it's so hard to pick. But if I have to say one, I would say This Side of Paradise. And I told Dorothy this. She wrote it. And I said, because you did it. It was a Jerry Soule script, and it was Sulu who falls in love, not Spock, but it just wasn't working. So Gene gave it to Dorothy to rewrite, and she said, first of all, let's make it Spock. If somebody's going to fall in love, it's got to be one of our top leads, and story-wise, it would be most interesting to make it somebody who's never fallen in love before, wasn't capable of falling in love before, and she handled the whole spores differently. Jerry had them in a cave. She brought them out of the cave, so they were more of a threat. They're everywhere. They're growing everywhere. They can be brought onto the Enterprise, and then, of course, the crew mutinies, goes down to the planet. And she knew how to keep Kirk, the protagonist, in that story, and yet it be such a profound story for Spock as well. So it's just incredible. And you just think of the last line of dialogue in that episode. After Spock has recovered, Kirk has freed him of the spores, which he didn't want. Spock would have happily stayed on that planet with Jill, Ireland. But Kirk frees him of the spores, and he's kind of quiet, little melancholy, Spock, on the bridge. And Kirk goes over to him and says, "Are you going to be okay?" And Spock looks at Kirk and he says, "For the first time in my life, I was happy." Oh, I mean, it's hard to even say that line and not get a little teary-eyed. That is dramatic writing at its best, and yet there's great comedy in that episode. There's great stuff for everybody in the cast to do. It still plays beautifully if you haven't seen This Side of Paradise. And I could give you a list of 20 more that you got to watch, but almost 79 more, but certainly 20. But go watch that. Go on to Hulu tonight or someplace and watch that episode, This Side of Paradise. It is just, TV writing doesn't get better than that. City on the Edge of Forever is pretty good writing too, but it doesn't get much better than that. And the acting and the music and everything. It's just brilliant.
It is a great episode. I 100% agree with you.
Yeah.
Is your friend going to kick you out in a minute? Because I had one more question for you.
We'll do one more. I'll try to give you a short answer.
Why do you think Star Trek has endured?
Because it means something. Because if you read these books, and I know you have, every episode had a theme. There's memos in every chapter. Every episode has a chapter, and there's memos in there about what they're trying to say with this episode. And so they a lot of thought went into these scripts. But thank God for NBC too, who I don't see as a villain. They're a villain that they canceled the show, but the ratings had dropped in the third season. But we're wrapping up, Deb.
You don't have to, honey. Just lock the door behind you when you leave.
Okay. There's a message. There's something going on besides the entertainment value, which is immense. The characters are so sharp. The conflict is there. The conflict between McCoy and Spock. The conflict between Vulcan looking at these humans and trying to live amongst these humans. You just could not devise a better show. It can go anywhere. It can go into any kind of a story because you come across a planet that can take you to all kinds of places. So it's just remarkable. But the characters are so sharp and so perfect to bring that conflict in there. They're such great heroes. A hero is somebody who would sacrifice themselves for somebody else. And all of them are willing to do that. We learn from them, their examples. It has the message of peace and love and getting along. It has the message that not all monsters are monsters. They're probably not. There's probably a reason they're doing what they're doing. And so it's just, you don't get writing better than that. You don't get presentation better than that. And for its time, those special effects were as good as it got as well. So, you know, I just think you can't do better than the original Star Trek. There's a lot of other shows I like. I love Breaking Bad. I loved The Sopranos. I loved Dexter. I loved Ozark. You know, on and on. But Monk. There are lots of great shows over the years. But I think Star Trek is the best show ever made, the best written show ever made. And that is it. Thank you, Debbie. You got it.
Can you give me a live long and prosper real quick?
I can even give you the salute. Live long and prosper. Anyone watching? Truly, live long and prosper. Be safe, be healthy, take care of yourselves. Be nice to each other.
That is fantastic. Thank you.